Welcome to 2 Samuel chapter 3. Now, right off the bat, I just want to say that if you've read this chapter, you're quickly going to see that this is a mini Jerry Springer episode happening right here, right now. We have a lot of different feuds of personal gain, of moral issues, and it's all happening in this chapter. So I'm going to do my best to break it down so we can get some understanding of what's going on. The chapter begins by telling us of the long war that's been happening between the house of Saul and the house of David. And at this point, Saul, he's dead, and Ishbosheth has been appointed as the king. But in reality, Abner is the real leader of the land, and he's just taking advantage of Ishbosheth's weakness as a leader. It mentions that David's kingdom grew stronger and stronger, while Saul's house, it grew weaker. And in the verses 2 through 5, during David's 7 years' reign in Hebron, he had 6 different wives that gave birth to 6 children. And see, right there we can see that David, he went against God's commandment that Israel's kings should not multiply wives for themselves. And this goes all the way back to Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 17. It says in that chapter, it says that God warns kings to not multiply their horses, their silver or gold, or their wives. And you see, these 3 things are 3 things that demonstrated status, it demonstrated strength and power. You see, the more horses that kings had, the stronger that their army was. The more silver and gold they had, the wealthier that kingdom was. And wives were often married to bring a unity or a peace between 2 different kingdoms. Now, God's warning to the kings was to ensure that they didn't put their trust in things of this world, but instead that they put their trust in God. And there's something that we can learn from this, because so many times we put our trust in our abilities or the things of this world like money or jobs or our 401ks. And you see, none of these things are wrong, but what we need to make sure that we do is that it's in the correct order and that we put God in his rightful place in our lives before anything else. You see, David, he was troubled because of these many wives. The Bible tells us that David reaped the penalty of this sort of sin in regards to his family. We read further on in the Bible that his kids, they really actually paid the price for this decision. Amnon raped his half-sister. Absalom was murdered his brother Amnon, and even tried to have a civil war against his own father, attempting to murder King David. And the list goes on and on of different things that happened to King David's kids because of this decision that he made. And continuing to read in verse 6, we see that it says, "It came about while there was still war between the house of Saul and the house of David that Abner was making himself strong in the house of Saul." Now you see, something about Abner is his actions weren't based on anything to do with King David. They had personal ambition and personal gains from the beginning. He didn't care that God had anointed David to be king. He only cared about wanting to build up his own power. And soon enough, in the midst of all this, Ishbosheth was pushing back on Abner and the lead that he had. And there was a big falling out between the 2 of them. We can see that in verse 10. And we see that Abner actually began to campaign to join Israel under the house of Judah and David. So basically, Abner just decided he was going to switch teams and go to the winning team. And this leads us all the way down to verse 12, where we see Abner, he sent messengers to David's team to make an allegiance with him. David was open to Abner's suggestions, but he required one thing from Abner, and that was to bring back Michal, David's ex-wife and Saul's daughter. And in order for David to allow the allegiance to happen, he wanted to see this one thing happen. Now, you see, I'm not going to get into this story because it's pretty wild and read it, you'll see it's pretty messed up. But jumping down to verses 22 through 27, we see a turn of events when Joab hears about the agreement that David made with Abner. And Joab was understandably upset by this. You see, Joab was just as powerful and ambitious as Abner. And through his loyalty to David, he continued to put his own interest above King David's. You see, Joab and Abner were actually 2 peas in a pod. They were very similar in their actions, in taking advantage of their position and power to self-promote themselves through different ranks. But Joab, he had 2 reasons that he wanted to kill Abner. He had a personal ambition of fear of losing a position in the kingdom, and he had a past feud from Abner killing his brother Asahel. Now, Joab carefully engineered this murder so that the killing was done outside of the gate of Hebron. And this is because Hebron was a city of refuge, and it was against the law for Joab as Asahel's blood avenger to kill Abner inside the city. Anyways, all of this eventually led to Joab being put to death by King Solomon in 1 Kings. And the Bible goes on to tell us that David, he renounced Joab's evil murder of Abner. David did not want his kingdom established by violence, and you see, he wanted God to establish his kingdom and for God to punish his enemies. It's important to note that David also gave Abner a proper burial, and this helped him to win over the hearts of the northern tribes. And we see a distinct difference between how Joab and Abner conducted their lives and how King David conducted his. Because time and time again, King David was faced with an opportunity to kill King Saul and take the reign that God had promised him at the age of 15. But he waited for God to appoint him in his timing. And that was actually about 15 years later. Anyway, a lot has happened in these 39 verses, but I want to try to leave you with a few takeaways. So number one, God's ways are always superior to human wisdom. We should put our hope in God and not in our own human understanding. The second thing that I want to leave with you is unresolved anger always gives way to bitterness, and bitterness will destroy your life if left unattended. And the third thing I want to leave with you is that violence will always lead to more violence, and anger will always lead to more anger. I pray that this chapter has helped you and that you would be growing closer and closer to God through these devotionals. God bless you, church.